Section 6 of The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 2. The Opinions and Beliefs of Crowds. Chapter 1. Remote Factors of the Opinions and Beliefs of Crowds. Preparatory factors of the beliefs of crowds. The origin of the beliefs of crowds is the consequence of a preliminary process of elaboration. Study of the different factors of these beliefs. 1. Race. The predominating influence it exercises. It represents the suggestions of ancestors. 2. Traditions. They are the synthesis of the soul of the race. Social importance of traditions. How, after having been necessary, they become harmful. Crowds are the most obstinate maintainers of traditional ideas. 3. Time. It prepares in succession the establishment of beliefs and then their destruction. It is by the aid of this factor that order may proceed from chaos. 4. Political and social institutions. Erroneous idea of their part. Their influence extremely weak. They are effects, not causes. Nations are incapable of choosing what appear to them the best institutions. Institutions are labels which shelter the most dissimilar things under the same title. How institutions may come to be created. Certain institutions theoretically bad, such as centralization obligatory for certain nations. 5. Institutions and education. Falsity of prevalent ideas as to the influence of instruction on crowds. Statistical indications. Demoralizing effect of Latin system of education. Part instruction might play. Examples furnished by various peoples. Having studied the mental constitution of crowds and become acquainted with their modes of feeling, thinking, and reasoning, we shall now proceed to examine how their opinions and beliefs arise and become established. The factors which determine these opinions and beliefs are of two kinds: remote factors and immediate factors. The remote factors are those which render crowds capable of adopting certain convictions and absolutely refractory to the acceptance of others. These factors prepare the ground in which are suddenly seen to germinate certain new ideas whose force and consequences are a cause of astonishment, though they are only spontaneous in appearance. The outburst and putting in practice of certain ideas among crowds present at times a startling suddenness. This is only a superficial effect, behind which must be sought a preliminary and preparatory action of long duration. The immediate factors are those which, coming on the top of this long preparatory working, in whose absence they would remain without effect, serve as the source of active persuasion on crowds. That is, they are the factors which cause the idea to take shape and set it loose with all its consequences. The resolutions by which collectivities are suddenly carried away arise out of these immediate factors. It is due to them that a riot breaks out or a strike is decided upon, and to them that enormous majorities invest one man with power to overthrow a government. The successive action of these two kinds of factors is to be traced in all great historical events. The French Revolution, to cite but one of the most striking of such events, had among its remote factors the writings of the philosophers, the exactions of the nobility, and the progress of scientific thought. The mind of the masses, thus prepared, was then easily roused by such immediate factors as the speeches of orators and the resistance of the court party to insignificant reforms. Among the remote factors there are some of a general nature, which are found to underlie all the beliefs and opinions of crowds. They are race, traditions, time, institutions, and education. We now proceed to study the influence of these different factors. 1. Race. This factor, race, must be placed in the first rank, for in itself it far surpasses in importance all the others. We have sufficiently studied it in another work, it is therefore needless to deal with it again. We showed in a previous volume what an historical race is, and how, its character once formed, it possesses, as the result of the laws of heredity, such power that its belief, institutions, and arts, in a word, all the elements of its civilization, are merely the outward expression of its genius. We showed that the power of the race is such that no element can pass from one people to another without understanding the most profound transformations. Footnote: The novelty of this proposition being still considerable, and history being quite unintelligible without it, I devoted 4 chapters to its demonstration in my last book, The Psychological Laws of the Evolution of Peoples. From it the reader will see that, in spite of fallacious appearances, neither language, religion, arts, or, in a word, any element of civilization can pass intact from one people to another. End of footnote. Environment, circumstances, and events represent the social suggestions of the moment. They may have a considerable influence, but this influence is always momentary if it be contrary to the suggestions of the race, that is, to those which are inherited by a nation from the entire series of its ancestors. We shall have occasion in several of the chapters of this work to touch again upon racial influence, and to show that this influence is so great that it dominates the characteristics peculiar to the genius of crowds. It follows from this fact that the crowds of different countries offer very considerable differences of beliefs and conduct, and are not to be influenced in the same manner. 2. Traditions. Traditions represent the ideas, the needs, and the sentiments of the past. They are the synthesis of the race and weigh upon us with immense force. The biological sciences have been transformed since embryology has shown the immense influence of the past on the evolution of living beings, and the historical sciences will not undergo a less change when this conception has become more widespread. As yet it is not sufficiently general, and many statesmen are still no further advanced than the theorists of the last century, who believed that a society could break off with its past and be entirely recast on lines suggested solely by the light of reason. A people is an organism created by the past, and, like every other organism, it can only be modified by slow hereditary accumulations. It is tradition that guides men, and more especially so when they are in a crowd. The changes they can effect in their traditions with any ease merely bear, as I have often repeated, upon names and outward forms. This circumstance is not to be regretted. Neither a national genius nor civilization would be possible without traditions. In consequence, man's 2 great concerns since he has existed have been to create a network of traditions which he afterwards endeavours to destroy when their beneficial effects have worn themselves out. Civilization is impossible without traditions, and progress impossible without the destruction of those traditions. The difficulty, and it is an immense difficulty, is to find a proper equilibrium between stability and variability. Should a people allow its customs to become too firmly rooted, it can no longer change, and becomes, like China, incapable of improvement. Violent revolutions are in this case of no avail, for what happens is that either the broken fragments of the chain are pieced together again, and the past resumes its empire without change, or the fragments remain apart, and decadence soon succeeds anarchy. The ideal for a people is in consequence to preserve the institutions of the past, merely changing them insensibly and little by little. This ideal is difficult to realize. The Romans in ancient and the English in modern times are almost alone in having realized it. It is precisely crowds that cling the most tenaciously to traditional ideas and oppose their being changed with the most obstinacy. This is notably the case with the category of crowds constituting castes. I have already insisted upon the conservative spirit of crowds, and shown that the most violent rebellions merely end in a changing of words and terms. At the end of the last century, in the presence of destroyed churches, of priests expelled from the country or guillotined, it might have been thought that the old religious ideas had lost all their strength, and yet a few years had barely lapsed before the abolished system of public worship had to be re-established in deference to universal demands. Footnote: the report of the ex-conventionist Fourcroy, quoted by Taine, is very clear on this point. Quote, "What is everywhere seen with respect to the keeping of Sunday and attendance at the churches proves that the majority of Frenchmen desire to return to their old usages, and that it is no longer opportune to resist this natural tendency. The great majority of men stand in need of religion, public worship, and priests. It is an error of some modern philosophers, by which I myself have been led away, To believe in the possibility of instruction being so general as to destroy religious prejudices, which for a great number of unfortunate persons are a source of consolation. The mass of the people then must be allowed its priests, its altars, and its public worship. Blotted out for a moment, the old traditions had resumed their sway. No example could better display the power of tradition on the mind of crowds. The most redoubtable idols do not dwell in temples, nor the most despotic tyrants in palaces. Both the one and the other can be broken in an instant, but the invisible masters that reign in our innermost selves are safe from every effort at revolt, and only yield to the slow wearing away of centuries. 3. Time. In social as in biological problems, time is one of the most energetic factors. It is the sole real creator and the sole great destroyer. It is time that has made mountains with grains of sand and raised the obscure cell of geological eras to human dignity. The action of centuries is sufficient to transform any given phenomenon. It has been justly observed that an ant with enough time at its disposal could level Mont Blanc. A being possessed of the magical force of varying time at his will would have the power attributed by believers to God. In this place, however, we have only to concern ourselves with the influence of time on the genesis of the opinions of crowds. Its action from this point of view is still immense. Dependent upon it are the great forces such as race, which cannot form themselves without it. It causes the birth, the growth, and the death of all beliefs. It is by the aid of time that they acquire their strength, and also by its aid that they lose it. It is time, in particular, that prepares the opinions and beliefs of crowds, or at least the soil in which they will germinate. This is why certain ideas are realizable at one epoch and not at another. It is time that accumulates that immense detritus of beliefs and thoughts on which the ideas of a given period spring up. They do not grow at hazard, and by chance. The roots of each of them strike down into a long past. When they blossom, it is time that has prepared their blooming, and to arrive at a notion of their genesis, it is always back in the past that it is necessary to search. They are the daughters of the past and the mothers of the future, but throughout the slaves of time. Time, in consequence, is our veritable master, and it suffices to leave it free to act to see all things transformed. At the present day we are very uneasy with regard to the threatening aspirations of the masses and the destruction and upheavals foreboded thereby. Time, without other aid, will see to the restoration of equilibrium. No form of government, M. Lavis very properly writes, was founded in a day. Political and social organizations are works that demand centuries. The feudal system existed for centuries in a shapeless, chaotic state before it found its laws. Absolute monarchy also existed for centuries before arriving at regular methods of government, and these periods of expectancy were extremely troubled. 4. Political and social institutions. The idea that institutions can remedy the defects of societies, that national progress is the consequence of the improvement of institutions and governments, and that social changes can be effected by decrees, this idea, I say, is still generally accepted. It was the starting point of the French Revolution, and the social theories of the present day are based upon it. The most continuous experience has been unsuccessful in shaking this grave delusion. Philosophers and historians have endeavoured in vain to prove its absurdity, but yet they have had no difficulty in demonstrating that institutions are the outcome of ideas, sentiments, and customs, and that ideas, sentiments, and customs are not to be recast by recasting legislative codes. A nation does not choose its institutions at will any more than it chooses the colour of its hair or its eyes. Institutions and governments are the product of the race. They are not the creators of an epoch, but are created by it. Peoples are not governed in accordance with their caprices of the moment, but as their character determines that they shall be governed. Centuries are required to form a political system, and centuries needed to change it. Institutions have no intrinsic virtue. In themselves they are neither good nor bad. Those which are good at a given moment for a given people may be harmful in the extreme for another nation. Moreover, it is in no way in the power of a people to really change its institutions. Undoubtedly, at the cost of violent revolutions, it can change their name, but in their essence they remain unmodified. The names are mere futile labels, with which an historian who goes to the bottom of things need scarcely concern himself. It is in this way, for instance, that England, the most advanced republicans, even of the United States, recognize this fact. The American magazine, The Forum, recently gave categorical expression to the opinion in terms which I reproduce here from the Review of Reviews for December 1894. Quote, "It should never be forgotten, even by the most ardent enemies of an aristocracy, that England is today the most democratic country of the universe, the country in which the rights of the individual are most respected, and in which the individual possesses the most liberty." Unquote. End of footnote. The most democratic country in the world lives, nevertheless, under a monarchical regime, whereas the countries in which the most oppressive despotism is rampant are the Spanish-American republics, in spite of their republican constitutions. The destinies of peoples are determined by their character and not by their government. I have endeavoured to establish this view in my previous volume by setting forth categorical examples. To lose time in the manufacture of cut-and-dried constitutions is, in consequence, a puerile task, the useless labour of an ignorant rhetorician. Necessity and time undertake the charge of elaborating constitutions when we are wise enough to allow these two factors to act. This is the plan the Anglo-Saxons have adopted, as their great historian Macaulay teaches us in a passage that the politicians of all Latin countries ought to learn by heart. After having shown all the good that can be accomplished by laws which appear from the point of view of pure reason a chaos of absurdities and contradictions, he compares the scores of constitutions that have been engulfed in the convulsions of the Latin peoples with that of England, and points out that the latter has only been very slowly changed part by part under the influence of immediate necessities and never of speculative reasoning. Quote, "To think nothing of symmetry and much of convenience, never to remove an anomaly merely because it is an anomaly, never to innovate except when some grievance is felt, never to innovate except so far as to get rid of the grievance, never to lay down any proposition of wider extent than the particular case for which it is necessary to provide. These are the rules which have, from the age of John to the age of Victoria, generally guided the deliberations of our 250 parliaments." Unquote. It would be necessary to take one by one the laws and institutions of each people to show to what extent they are the expression of the needs of each race, and are incapable for that reason of being violently transformed. It is impossible, for instance, to indulge in philosophical dissertations on the advantages and disadvantages of centralization, but when we see a people composed of very different races devote 1,000 years of efforts to attaining to this centralization, when we observe that a great revolution, having for object the destruction of all the institutions of the past, has been forced to respect this centralization, and has even strengthened it, under these circumstances we should admit that it is the outcome of imperious needs, that it is a condition of the existence of the nation in question, and we should pity the poor mental range of politicians who talk of destroying it. Could they by chance succeed in this attempt, their success would at once be the signal for a frightful civil war. Footnote. If a comparison be made between the profound religious and political dissensions which separate the various parties in France, and are more especially the result of social questions, and the separatist tendencies which were manifested at the time of the Revolution, and began to again display themselves towards the close of the Franco-German War, it will be seen that the different races represented in France are still far from being completely blended. The vigorous centralization of the Revolution and the creation of artificial departments destined to bring about the fusion of the ancient provinces was certainly its most useful work. Were it possible to bring about the decentralization which is today preoccupying minds lacking in foresight, the achievement would promptly have for consequence the most sanguinary disorders. To overlook this fact is to leave out of account the entire history of France. End of footnote. which, moreover, would immediately bring back a new system of centralization much more oppressive than the old. The conclusion to be drawn from what precedes is that it is not in institutions that the means is to be sought of profoundly influencing the genius of the masses. When we see certain countries, such as the United States, reach a high degree of prosperity under democratic institutions, while others, such as the Spanish American republics, are found existing in a pitiable state of anarchy under absolutely similar institutions, we should admit that these institutions are as foreign to the greatness of the one as to the decadence of the others. Peoples are governed by their character, and all institutions which are not intimately modelled on that character merely represent a borrowed garment, a transitory disguise. No doubt sanguinary wars and violent revolutions have been undertaken and will continue to be undertaken to impose institutions to which is attributed, as to the relics of saints, the supernatural power of creating welfare. It may be said then, in one sense, that institutions react on the mind of the crowd inasmuch as they engender such upheavals. But in reality it is not the institutions that react in this manner, since we know that, whether triumphant or vanquished, they possess in themselves no virtue. It is illusions and words that have influenced the mind of the crowd, and especially words which are as powerful as they are chimerical, and whose astonishing sway we shall shortly demonstrate. 5. Instruction and education. Foremost among the dominant ideas of the present epoch is to be found the notion that instruction is capable of considerably changing men, and has for its unfailing consequence to improve them and even to make them equal. By the mere fact of its being constantly repeated, this assertion has ended by becoming one of the most steadfast democratic dogmas. It would be as difficult now to attack it as it would have been formerly to have attacked the dogmas of the Church. On this point, however, as on many others, democratic ideas are in profound disagreement with the results of psychology and experience. Many eminent philosophers, among them Herbert Spencer, have had no difficulty in showing that instruction neither renders a man more moral nor happier, that it changes neither his instincts nor his hereditary passions, and that at times for this to happen it need only be badly directed. It is much more pernicious than useful. Statisticians have brought confirmation of these views by telling us that criminality increases with the generalization of instruction, or at any rate of a certain kind of instruction, and that the worst enemies of society, the anarchists, are recruited among the prize winners of schools, while in a recent work a distinguished magistrate, M. Adolphe Guillot, made the observation that at present 3,000 educated criminals are met with for every 1,000 illiterate delinquents, and that in 50 years the criminal percentage of the population has passed from 227 to 552 for every 100,000 inhabitants, an increase of 133%. He has also noted, in common with his colleagues, that criminality is particularly on the rise among young persons, for whom, as is known, gratuitous and obligatory schooling has in France replaced apprenticeship. It is not assuredly, and nobody has ever maintained this proposition, that well-directed instruction may not give very useful practical results, if not in the sense of raising the standard of morality, at least in that of developing professional capacity. Unfortunately, the Latin peoples, especially in the last 25 years, have based their system of instruction on very erroneous principles, and in spite of the observations of the most eminent minds, such as Brel, Fustel de Coulanges, Taine, and many others, they persist in their lamentable mistakes. I have myself shown, in a work published some time ago, that the French system of education transforms the majority of those who have undergone it into enemies of society, and recruits numerous disciples for the worst forms of socialism. The primary danger of this system of education, very properly qualified as Latin, consists in the fact that it is based on the fundamental psychological error that the intelligence is developed by the learning by heart of textbooks. Adopting this view, the endeavour has been made to enforce a knowledge of as many handbooks as possible. From the primary school till he leaves the university, a young man does nothing but acquire books by heart, without his judgment or personal initiative being ever called into play. Education consists for him in reciting by heart and obeying. Learning lessons, knowing by heart a grammar or a compendium, repeating well and imitating well, that," writes a former Minister of Public Instruction, M. Jules Simon, "is a ludicrous form of education whose every effort is an act of faith, tacitly admitting the infallibility of the master, and whose only results are a belittling of ourselves and a rendering of us impotent." Were this education merely useless, one might confine oneself to expressing compassion for the unhappy children who, instead of making needful studies at the primary school, are instructed in the genealogy of the sons of Clotaire, the conflicts between Neustria and Austrasia, or the zoological classifications. But the system presents a far more serious danger. It gives those who have been submitted to it a violent dislike to the state of life in which they were born, and an intense desire to escape from it. The working man no longer wishes to remain a working man, or the peasant to continue a peasant, while the most humble members of the middle classes admit of no possible career for their sons except that of state-paid functionaries. Instead of preparing men for life, French schools solely prepare them to occupy public functions, in which success can be attained without any necessity for self-direction or the exhibition of the least glimmer of personal initiative. At the bottom of the social ladder, the system creates an army of proletarians discontented with their lot and always ready to revolt, while at the summit it brings into being a frivolous bourgeoisie, at once sceptical and credulous, having a superstitious confidence in the state, whom it regards as a sort of providence, but without forgetting to display towards it a ceaseless hostility, always laying its own faults to the door of the government, and incapable of the least enterprise without the intervention of the authorities. The state, which manufactures by dint of textbooks all these persons possessing diplomas, can only utilize a small number of them, and is forced to leave the others without employment. It is obliged in consequence to resign itself to feeding the first mentioned and to having the others as its enemies. From the top to the bottom of the social pyramid, from the humblest clerk to the professor and the prefect, the immense mass of persons boasting diplomas besiege the professions, while a businessman has the greatest difficulty in finding an agent to represent him in the colonies. Thousands of candidates solicit the most modest official posts. There are 20,000 schoolmasters and mistresses without employment. In the department of the Seine alone, all of them persons who, disdaining the fields or the workshops, look to the state for their livelihood. The number of the chosen being restricted, that of the discontented is perforce immense. The latter are ready for any revolution, whoever be its chiefs and whatever the goal they aim at. The acquisition of knowledge for which no use can be found is a sure method of driving a man to revolt. This phenomenon, moreover, is not peculiar to the Latin peoples. It is also to be observed in China, which is also a country in the hands of a solid hierarchy of mandarins or functionaries, and where a function is obtained, as in France, by competitive examination, in which the only test is the imperturbable recitation of bulky manuals. The army of educated persons without employment is considered in China at the present day as a veritable national calamity. It is the same in India, where, since the English have opened schools, not for educating purposes, as is the case in England itself, but simply to furnish the indigenous inhabitants with instruction, there has been formed a special class of educated persons, the baboos, who, when they do not obtain employment, become the irreconcilable enemies of the English rule. In the case of all the baboos, whether provided with employment or not, the first effect of their instruction has been to lower their standard of morality. This is a fact on which I have insisted at length in my book, The Civilizations of India, a fact, too, which has been observed by all authors who have visited the great peninsula. It is evidently too late to retrace our steps. Experience alone, that supreme educator of peoples, will be at pains to show us our mistake. It alone will be powerful enough to prove the necessity of replacing our odious textbooks and our pitiable examinations by industrial instruction capable of inducing our young men to return to the fields, to the workshop, and to the colonial enterprise which they avoid today at all costs. The professional instruction which all enlightened minds are now demanding was the instruction received in the past by our forefathers. It is still in vigour at the present day among the nations who rule the world by their force of will, their initiative, and their spirit of enterprise. In a series of remarkable pages, whose principal passages I reproduce further on, a great thinker, M. Taine, has clearly shown that our former system of education was approximately that in vogue today in England and America, and in a remarkable parallel between the Latin and Anglo-Saxon systems he has plainly pointed out the consequences of the two methods. One might consent, perhaps, at a pinch, to continue to accept all the disadvantages of our classical education, although it produced nothing but discontented men, and men unfitted for their station in life. Did the superficial acquisition of so much knowledge, the faultless repeating by heart of so many textbooks, raise the level of intelligence? But does it really raise this level? Alas, no. The conditions of success in life are the possession of judgment, experience, initiative, and character, qualities which are not bestowed by books. Books are dictionaries, which it is useful to consult, but of which it is perfectly useless to have lengthy portions in one's head. How is it possible for professional instruction to develop the intelligence in a measure quite beyond the reach of classical instruction? This has been well shown by M. Taine. Quote, "Ideas," he says, "are only formed in their natural and normal surroundings. The promotion of the growth is effected by the innumerable impressions appealing to the senses which a young man receives daily in the workshop, the mine, the law court, the study, the builder's yard, the hospital, at the sight of tools, materials, and operations, in the presence of customers, workers, and labour, of work well or ill done, costly or lucrative. In such a way are obtained those trifling perceptions of detail of the eyes, the ear, the hands, and even the sense of smell, which, picked up involuntarily and silently elaborated, take shape within the learner and suggest to him, sooner or later, this or that new combination, simplification, economy, improvement, or invention. The young Frenchman is deprived, and precisely at the age when they are most fruitful, of all these precious contacts, of all these indispensable elements of assimilation. For 7 or 8 years on end he is shut up in a school and is cut off from that direct personal experience which would give him a keen and exact notion of men and things and of the various ways of handling them." Unquote. Quote, "At least 9 out of 10 have wasted their time and pains during several years of their life, telling important, even decisive years. Among such are to be counted, first of all, the half of 2/3 of those who present themselves for examination. I refer to those who are rejected, and then among those who are successful, who obtain a degree, a certificate, a diploma, there is still a half or 2/3. I refer to the overworked. Too much has been demanded of them by exacting that on a given day, on a chair or before a board, they should, for 2 hours in succession, and with respect to a group of sciences, be living repertories of all human knowledge. In point of fact, they were that, or nearly so, for 2 hours on that particular day. But a month later they are so no longer. They could not go through the examination again. Their too numerous and too burdensome acquisitions slip incessantly from their mind, and are not replaced. Their mental vigour has declined. Their fertile capacity for growth has dried up. The fully developed man appears, and he is often a used-up man, settled down, married, resigned to turning in a circle, and indefinitely in the same circle. He shuts himself up in his confined function, which he fulfills adequately, but nothing more. Such is the average yield. Assuredly the receipts do not balance the expenditure. In England or America, where, as in France previous to 1789, the contrary proceeding is adopted, the outcome obtained is equal or superior." Unquote. The illustrious psychologist subsequently shows us the difference between our system and that of the Anglo-Saxons. The latter do not possess our innumerable special schools. With them instruction is not based on book learning, but on object lessons. The engineer, for example, is trained in a workshop, and never at a school, a method which allows of each individual reaching the level his intelligence permits of. He becomes a workman or a foreman if he can get no farther, an engineer if his aptitudes take him as far. This manner of proceeding is much more democratic and of much greater benefit to society than that of making the whole career of an individual depend on an examination, lasting a few hours, and undergone at the age of 19 or 20. Quote, "In the hospital, the mine, the factory, in the architect's or the lawyer's office, the student who makes a start while very young goes through his apprenticeship, stage by stage, much as does with us a law clerk in his office or an artist in his studio. Previously, and before making a practical beginning, he has had an opportunity of following some general and summary course of instruction, so as to have a framework ready prepared in which to store the observations he is shortly to make. Furthermore, he is able, as a rule, to avail himself of sundry technical courses, which he can follow in his leisure hours, so as to coordinate step by step the daily experience he is gathering. Under such a system, the practical capabilities increase and develop of themselves in exact proportion to the faculties of the student, and in the direction requisite for his future task and the special work for which from now onwards he desires to fit himself. By this means, in England or in the United States, a young man is quickly in a position to develop his capacity to the utmost. At 25 years of age, and much sooner, if the material and the parts are there, he is not merely a useful performer, he is capable also of spontaneous enterprise. He is not only a part of a machine, but also a motor. In France, where the contrary system prevails, in France, which with each succeeding generation is falling more and more into line with China, the sum total of the wasted forces is enormous." Unquote. The great philosopher arrives at the following conclusion with respect to the growing incongruity between our Latin system of education and the requirements of practical life. Quote, "In the three stages of instruction, those of childhood, adolescence, and youth, the theoretical and pedagogic preparation by books on the school benches has lengthened out and become overcharged in view of the examination, the degree, the diploma, and the certificate, and solely in this view, and by the worst methods, by the application of an unnatural and antisocial regime, by the excessive postponement of the practical apprenticeship, by our boarding school system, by artificial training and mechanical cramming, by overwork without thought for the time that is to follow, for the adult age and the functions of the man, without regard for the real world on which the young man will shortly be thrown, for the society in which we move and to which he must be adapted or be taught, to resign himself in advance for the struggle in which humanity is engaged, and in which to defend himself and to keep his footing he ought previously to have been equipped, armed, trained, and hardened. This indispensable equipment, this acquisition of more importance than any other, this sturdy common sense and nerve and will power our schools do not procure the young Frenchman. On the contrary, far from qualifying him for his approaching and definite state, they disqualify him. In consequence, his entry into the world and his first steps in the field of action are most often merely a succession of painful falls, whose effect is that he long remains wounded and bruised, and sometimes disabled for life. The test is severe and dangerous. In the course of it, the mental and moral equilibrium is affected, and runs the risk of not being re-established. Too sudden and complete disillusion has supervened. The deceptions have been too great, the disappointments too keen. Footnote: Taine, Le Régime Moderne, Volume 2, 1894. These pages are almost the last that Taine wrote. They resume admirably the results of the great philosopher's long experience. Unfortunately, they are in my opinion totally incomprehensible for such of our university professors who have not lived abroad. Education is the only means at our disposal of influencing to some extent the mind of a nation, and it is profoundly saddening to have to think that there is scarcely anyone in France who can arrive at understanding that our present system of teaching is a grave cause of rapid decadence, which, instead of elevating our youth, lowers and perverts it. A useful comparison may be made between Taine's pages and the observations on American education recently made by M. Paul Bourget in his excellent book Outre-mer. He too, after having noted that our education merely produces narrow-minded bourgeois, lacking in initiative and will-power, or anarchists, those two equally harmful types of the civilized man, who degenerates into impotent platitude or insane destructiveness, He too, I say, draws a comparison that cannot be the object of too much reflection between our French lycées, public schools, those factories of degeneration, and the American schools, which prepare a man admirably for life. The gulf existing between truly democratic nations and those who have democracy in their speeches, but in no wise in their thoughts, is clearly brought out in this comparison. Have we digressed in what precedes from the psychology of crowds? Assuredly not. If we desire to understand the ideas and beliefs that are germinating today in the masses and will spring up tomorrow, it is necessary to know how the ground has been prepared. The instruction given the youth of a country allows of a knowledge of what that country will one day be. The education accorded the present generation justifies the most gloomy previsions. It is in part by instruction and education that the mind of the masses is improved or deteriorated. It was necessary in consequence to show how this mind has been fashioned by the system in vogue, and how the mass of the indifferent and the neutral has become progressively an army of the discontented, ready to obey all the suggestions of utopians and rhetoricians. It is in the schoolroom that socialists and anarchists are found nowadays, and that the way is being paved for the approaching period of decadence for the Latin peoples. End of section 6.